Sensacional, fui convidado pelo pessoal do Inédit, que está aí na 13ª edição 2021. Com muito orgulho aceitei, porque a entrevista de hoje é com um sujeito que eu gosto demais, um diretor canadense que eu aprecio muito o trabalho dele, que entre outros documentários ele fez esse aqui, que é o Headbanger's Journey, muito bom. Mr. Sandan, be welcome, my friend.
Hi, Gastão. How are you? Thanks for having me.
My name is Sam Dunn, headbanger, rocker, and anthropologist. I'm going to take you into the world of heavy metal.
I'm here to talk with you about this documentary that I like so much, Headbanger's Journey. Was it your first experience with video in your life?
Yeah, that was our first documentary. My business partner and creative partner, Scott McFadden, we, in 2004, embarked on this, at that time, seemed like a kind of crazy idea about making a in-depth documentary about heavy metal music and culture. And Scott had worked in film before. He was a music supervisor and was working on set in different productions. I had just finished my graduate degree in anthropology, and I wanted to write a book about heavy metal, because I felt that, metal was changing at that time, and there was a lot of interesting questions about the state of metal in the early 2000s. And then Scott said, well, what about a documentary? Has there ever been a really good, detailed documentary made about metal music and the culture that surrounds it? And we did some research and discovered that no one had really done it. So we embarked on that journey to make that first film for both of us.
Besides the fact of you were a big fan of the style, you had a radio show too. Am I right?
Yeah, you've done your research. It was I grew up in Victoria, BC, which is on the far west of Canada, near Vancouver, and like many of us who get into metal, I got into it as a young teenager, and there was a very, very small local radio station at the university, and there was a radio show every Saturday night called Overkill. And it was the only place where you could hear underground metal. And of course, metal was on MTV and Much Music, but it was more like the underground stuff that I was into. And then one day, a friend of mine told me, well, the hosts of that show are leaving the show. Do you want to do it? And I'm like, I'm only 16. Is it legal? Like, am I allowed to be on the radio? Technically, I'm not sure if I was, but in any case, yeah, that was our show, Overkill Radio, 1 hour every Saturday night. And, that was the day of tape trading and demos. And so we just played everything that we could get our hands on.
Heavy metal was the moral panic of the day. And metal fans, they were considered lowlifes, dead-end kids, the bane of society. How do I know all of this? Because I was one of them.
The early 2000s was an interesting time for heavy metal, I think, for two reasons. One was that nu metal had emerged as this really commercially popular form of metal around the world. Limp Bizkit, Linkin Park, Papa Roach, and Korn, of course, and others. So that was one. And then two, some of the older legacy bands, like particularly Maiden, were making a resurgence. Bruce Dickinson had recently reformed or come back to the band, and they'd recorded Brave New World, which was a big album for them. And so these two sort of things happening at once, it said to me, well, it seems like we're entering into a new era of metal music, and all of the questions that fans were asking about nu metal, right, was, is it really metal? Is this something that we should be celebrating? Is this just something for the mainstream? Was exactly the same conversations that were happening in the 80s with glam metal. And that for me was sort of a moment where I thought, well, it seems like there's a history to this music that needs to be told. It's clearly not going away. It's back in a whole different way. And just kind of made me realize it was maybe time to look back on the genre.
Back when I was a kid practicing air guitar leaps off my front porch, my band of choice was Iron Maiden. I memorized every note, every riff, and every solo.
To do this kind of documentary demands a lot of research, pre-production, a lot of time. Don't you think so? How long did it take for you to do the whole process?
Longer than I really want to tell you. It's kind of embarrassing, to be honest. But if we literally talk from like the first time that Scott and I talked about it to when the film premiered at the Toronto Film Festival in 2005, it was 5 years.
5 years.
You know, it took us time to do the research, as you say, but also a lot of time to raise the money. We were first-time filmmakers. We didn't have a lot of contacts in the metal community at that time. We really started from scratch. And so it took 3 years to get the money together and then about 2 years to actually make the film. I didn't have a background in filmmaking. You know, Scott certainly had some experience in film, but, you know, speaking personally, I'd never written for a documentary before. It was a classic case of just learning as we went and making lots of mistakes and doing the wrong thing, you know, and then maybe the smartest thing we did is we just found really good, creative, reliable people who are experienced editors or cinematographers and so on who could help us make it happen.
How many people were in the crew with you when you were recording?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think the crew at that time was around 6 people. I never forget the first trip we took filming was to Europe. We went to Norway and to Wacken and then over to England. That was the first leg of the journey. And I remember we arrived in Oslo and like day one, our sound guy's suitcase didn't appear and there was complications with paperwork. And so, yeah, it was a steep learning curve for sure.
Very expensive country too, huh? Norway.
Expensive place to start. Yeah, we really had to think twice before we had a beer at the end of a long shooting day.
Actually, the first time heavy metal was ever used as about Alice Cooper.
Did you have a deadline to finish the documentary, or?
You know, I'd like to say we knew what we were doing and we had a deadline and we had it all worked out. I mean, now we know roughly films take around 18 months to make once you have the financing in place, and that's kind of the general rhythm. But at that time, no, we didn't really have a deadline. Obviously, we had financiers who wanted us to deliver the film. We had put together what we thought was a timeline, but inevitably it took longer than we thought.
Who could forget glam metal? Influenced by the shock rock bands of the 1970s, glam was largely responsible for making metal the world's most popular music during the 1980s.
Metal evolution. I've heard you say that you went to 40 different cities, 12 different countries. That must be a huge expense too, huh?
Yeah, I mean, Metal Evolution, that was a whole other level. That was our first series we'd done, you know. After Headbanger's Journey, you know, we did Global Metal, and then we did a few films about specific artists, you know, Maiden and Rush and so on. And then 2009, we got the financing to make our first series, which was great. And it was really the people at VH1 in the US. We went to them and proposed that we do a series based on the heavy metal family tree. and do episodes on each different subgenre of metal, and they went for it.
I love those family trees that you do. That's crazy stuff. That's fan stuff.
It's great, but we created a monster because there's no way you can keep on top of it. Like, especially now, like, we're thankful, like, fans contribute to Banger TV, our YouTube page, and to our Patreon. And, and so we, some fans get those posters as part of their contribution. But, that poster's it's like 15 years old now. And every time I look at it and go, we should update this, smoke starts to come out of my ears because I don't know where to start, because metal is just so infinitely bigger and infinitely more complex than 15 years ago.
A battle working on summer just to try to earn a dollar. But Lord, I tried to call my baby, I tried to get a date.
Do you still work with anthropology?
Cool. I mean, I guess personally, because it's my background, I guess it's just how I look at the world. I think that whether it's making films or not, I think really anthropology, it's a very simple kind of perspective, and that is understanding humans and culture in an interconnected way, that everything is connected. So, in the case of metal, you can't just talk about metal without talking about, different regions of the world and how people got access to metal and what their cultural, religious, economic backgrounds are. And, that's the stuff that really fascinates me, is how all those things are interconnected, because, music is never just about music. There's always a lot more to talk about.
In metal, I think fans are as important as the bands, as the music. Don't you think so?
Yeah, looking back, when we started, I was really struck by how few music documentaries or even live concert films, there was no fans that were included in the story or the imagery or the portrayal of whatever the subject was. And I just felt that was so odd. I just, with the case of metal, we just had the conviction that you couldn't really properly understand metal without talking to the fans, because we know, the musicians are also fans, right? And the people that work in the metal industry for the labels and the management companies and now websites are fans too. So we just didn't think you could make a good documentary about metal without talking to fans.
I'm 13 years old, 14 on Halloween, which I'm proud of, and I grew up in a small town in Quebec where everyone likes Shania Twain and Avril Lavigne, so I've changed a lot over the last couple years, and they'd be like, what happened to you, Satan has arrived.
Let's talk about the interviews. I think it's a tough job for us because you have a short time to make deep questions. Don't you think so?
Yeah, and I was terrible at the beginning. Man, I wish I could have some of those interviews back. I'd always get teased on the set, for how long my questions are. I tend to be a little bit long-winded. So we didn't really have a lot of experience. And certainly me as an interviewer, I had to learn pretty quickly, like, how to get people comfortable and how to get to the subject. Because, if you're backstage at Wacken and you've only got 20 minutes, and you kind of want to get in deep into the story, right? It's challenging. So we are always like, we need an hour minimum. We need an hour, and we always had to fight for that.
Did you have to cut a lot of material?
Oh yeah. I don't know the number exactly. It's been a few years, but dozens and dozens of hours for that first film. And I think over the years we've got better at knowing exactly how much material we need before we go out to film, you know, and being a bit more economical that way with our time and our money and our energy. But at that time, yeah, there was, you know, a lot of those interviews were way longer than they needed to be, you know? And so, you know, it's the old thing, like, if I knew what I knew now, you know, some aspects of it might be better, but at the same time, you know, maybe a little dose of naivety is helpful, because you have that boundless curiosity and boundless passion for doing it.
Do you have an idea how many interviews did you make for Headbanger's Journey?
It was, I think, around 50 or 60 in total, I would say. It's pretty foggy now, but, you know, we traveled obviously all through Europe, through Canada and the US. So yeah, I think it was around 50 or so.
But it was Tony Iommi, Sabbath's guitarist, who was responsible for creating the band's sound and the first true heavy metal riffs.
When I first heard the term heavy metal, I hadn't got the faintest idea what they were talking about, which was many years ago, when I was doing an interview and somebody said, "Oh, about this heavy metal." And what? What's that?
I think it was hard to choose the right musicians to interview, wasn't it?
Well, you know, yes, but it was also hard to get access to them, you know, again, because it was our first movie. We really had to do a lot of heavy lifting, persistently reaching out to artists. And I always give a shout out to Rod Smallwood, Iron Maiden's manager, because he was one of the few people that really believed in us at the beginning. And he helped us. Obviously, we got the interview with Bruce Dickinson and helped kind of put the word out to other managers in the community that, hey, there's these guys from Canada that are making this movie. And I think, you know, the way they're approaching it is smart, you know, and so that's what helped us get interviews with Tony Iommi and with Slipknot and so on. So, you know, it helps having Rod Smallwood in your corner. Let's just say when you're out there trying to make a metal movie and no one knows who you are.
I bet. And you did that with Bruce in Hammersmith Odeon. Am I right?
Yeah, man. Yeah, I mean,
it's a beautiful place. Huh?
I mean, now, as I say in the movie, you know, if the 12-year-old me knew I was doing it, I probably would have, you know, had an accident in my pants because, you know, Maiden's my all-time favorite metal band. And, you know, I grew up listening to Live After Death. Live After Death was like a really important album for me because it had songs from deep into the catalog. And, of course, a lot of those songs were recorded at Hammersmith. So I don't know how many times I heard Bruce say, "Scream for me, Hammersmith," you know, in my bedroom as a teenager, but probably more than I care to admit. So yeah, interviewing Bruce on that stage was amazing.
Well, now I'm on my way to interview Maiden's legendary singer, Bruce Dickinson. And if the 12-year-old Sam knew about this, he'd be freaking out. But I gotta keep it together, even though I'm interviewing him on the stage of London's famous venue, the Hammersmith Odeon.
And sometimes that interview that was not so good is also as important, like you did with Mayhem. That's historical, man.
Yeah.
How was that?
Well, I'd like to think we planned it, but we didn't, you know, and it wasn't until after we were in the edit suite, you know, we were working on the film. We'd always thought that the Mayhem interview was garbage. But then, you know, we started to explore a little bit of humor in the film. We weren't sure how much humor, how serious we wanted to make the film, how much humor there was in the film, because we were aware of, you know, obviously Spinal Tap and Wayne's World, like that's not what we were doing, right? But at the same time, we slowly began to realize that metalheads like to laugh at themselves too. And so that Mayhem interview ended up ironically being the most talked about interview we've ever done. And it was like, it wasn't even going to make it into the film at one point. So there you go. Learn as you go.
Which one? Who the fuck are you talking to? Fuck them, you know.
Do you have any comments about that?
Fuck them. Yeah, I have a comment. Fuck you.
I love the voiceovers in your documentaries. Is it the last thing to record?
it's one of the last things. And man, that's another thing. I was so terrible in the voiceover booth. I'd never done that kind of thing before. I'd spent some time like talking in front of crowds, you know, in high school and university. So I kind of felt comfortable with that, but getting used to your voice on camera in the voiceover booth, it was just agony. And I remember Scott just saying, "Oh man, you're terrible. We're never going to get this." And it took a lot of practice. It sounds crazy, but it's hard to sound like yourself. You know, and anyone in acting and in the film world knows this, but that's not where I came from. So I really had to learn to find the way to talk that sounded natural and sounded like me. And so, yeah, it took a long time. So yeah, it was one of the last things we did, but also partly because I was just so terrible and I needed so much practice.
I think it gives a touch of poetry.
Thank you. I mean, that took a lot of work, you know, and we worked with a great writer who sadly is passed away now, Dennis McGrath, and he was an experienced TV writer. He really helped us with the narration, particularly finding the right words. And I remember, just being awake in bed at night, worrying about, especially the ending of the film, like really wanting to like get how do you sum it all up and get the essence of the journey kind of right. It took a lot of work, but I think, you know, we wanted to find a way to articulate it so that the fans would feel something, but also people who were outside the genre that they got something out of the journey as well.
So here we are, 35 years after Black Sabbath first played The Devil's Note, and metal culture is still thriving. A new generation of fans has emerged, and the old guard is going strong.
We never really wanted to make a film just for metal fans, and no discredit to metal fans, but that's kind of the easier part, right? As long as you tick the right boxes. In a sense, I don't think it's easy, but it's easier getting that bigger audience in, you know, people who don't know anything about metal or have stereotypes or misconceptions about metal, or like, you know, all the metalheads in school were just these, you know, misfits and outsiders, etc. I think those were the people that we really wanted to bring into the story.
Did you take part in the editing too, or?
Yeah. Both Scott and I worked very closely with our editor, Mike Munn, who was one of those super, super helpful, experienced people that we brought on right at the beginning. He still works with us now, all these years later. He's one of the greatest editors in Canada, and he's one of the greatest editors we've ever worked with. And, you know, I think we spent something like, I don't know, like 8 months editing that movie. Again, part of that because we were so inexperienced, right? And you know, sometimes, not always, sometimes we're more efficient now, but man, if we didn't have Mike, I don't know what we would have done.
Can be a never-ending process.
Oh, well, that's the creative process, right? It's like any musician will tell you about making another record, or you know, it's like you think you know how to do it, but then the moment you say you think you know how to do it is the moment that you know deep down that you really don't. And so that's the creative process. Is each film is different, each project's different, the obstacles are different. So I'd like to think it's getting easier all these years later, but it never really gets easy.
Black and Western culture in general is a very interesting thing. It means of danger, it means evil, but also, again, of freedom.
Well, you know, we had success early on, which enabled us to build a bigger team of people. And then, you know, once we did Metal Evolution, our first series, sort of from that point forward was really when we started to do multiple projects at a time, which was a big step. A big learning curve, making a movie and a series at the same time, and how to make all the pieces work together properly. So yeah, but we've got, you know, like our editor, Mike Munn, we've got people that have been with us since the very beginning. You know, our tech supervisor and our graphic designer have been with us for 17 years now. So we're just lucky to have built such an incredible team at Banger.
And look, you did some documentaries about the genre, and then you decided doing documentaries about bands. Man, you can do about any band in the world. That's an amazing idea. Which one was the first? Was this one? Iron Maiden?
Yeah, actually, we started. It's a bit of a complicated story, but we actually started making Rush.
This one
first, after Global Metal. After we did Headbangers Journey, Global Metal, and then we started Rush. But then, as we were making Rush, we got the opportunity to do the Maiden film, which of course was super time sensitive because it was based on the tour and it kind of had to come together very quickly. So we were very lucky. We asked the Rush management if we could just put a hold on the Rush film so we could do this Maiden film. So that's kind of how it ended up working out. The Maiden film ended up coming out first, even though we'd started Rush earlier.
So the partnership with Rodney Smallwood really worked.
Yeah, it sure did. And, you know, Headbangers Journey was a success for us too because the musicians liked it, right? And I think, you know, looking back, it was, you know, the first time that we put together anyone had really put together so many high profile metal and rock musicians in one film. And they really respected the way we handled the story. And so that's what enabled us to build relationships with Maiden and with Rush and, you know, then eventually Alice Cooper and then eventually, you know, ZZ Top and others that we've made films with.
Triumph.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. I love Triumph. I have every record they put out, man.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's the next one. It's coming soon.
You must get a closer relation with the musician. Don't you think so, to do this kind of documentary? Is it easy for you?
It's never easy. It's about trust, really, you know, and I think now it's easier because we have a body of work that people know. There's kind of trust that's already starting to build because they like the way you handled other projects, right? So, but then there's always a process of establishing trust with the particular artist and taking time to get them to feel comfortable to open up. And because, you know, like any documentary filmmaker, we're not unique, right? Every documentary filmmaker is looking to establish that trust and looking to be able to get to places in the story that no one else has, of course. So it takes time and, you know, maybe now a little bit of experience.
Sometimes you have to do more than one interview.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of those films about specific artists, Rush, Maiden, Alice, ZZ, Triumph, like there's multiple interviews with the band members themselves, sometimes 3 or 4 that have been conducted over a period of months. Because often you find you do the first interview and you go into the edit suite and take a look at it and sort of assess, okay, what's good, what's not going to matter, what do we need to ask about again, because we're not really happy with the answer. So there's a lot of movement between the edit suite and then back out into the interview setting.
Would you do a documentary of a band that you don't like? Is it possible to do it with passion and to get this kind of result that you get?
I mean, put it this way, it's not something we've ever done. You know, made a film about an artist that we actually didn't like. I think that would be challenging, but it also depends on what the goal of the documentary is, right? if ultimately the goal is to celebrate the artist in some way, which most of our films are, because we make films with these legacy bands that have decades of backstory to their careers. But at the same time, you know, with, for example, ZZ Top and Triumph, like I respect their music, but they weren't bands that I grew up being super passionate about, like I was with Maiden and Rush. So, and you know what? I actually like that in some ways, because it means you don't have all of the baggage of a fan, you know, and when you're a fan and you're talking to these artists, it's sometimes hard to get out of your fan head, right? And so over the years, I've actually really enjoyed and embraced the opportunities to work on projects with musicians or others that I'm not a deep fan of.
And after Triumph, which band is the next subject?
Well, we don't have any projects confirmed. I mean, there's a handful of bands that I would love to make films about someday, you know, and it's pretty interesting. Like, there's still a handful of really high profile, celebrated rock and metal bands that haven't had their definitive story, you know, and in fact, the list is quite long. Black Sabbath, Van Halen, AC/DC. I mean, even Metallica, I mean, Some Kind of Monster is a really fantastic documentary film in many, many ways. And they did Through the Never and other projects, but they've never done the big story. So, you know, when you start to think about it, there's a lot of stories still out there in the rock and metal world.
I'm going to talk to Ronnie James Dio again. We really hit it off at the Wacken Festival, so he invited me over to his house to continue our conversation.
And to finish here, Sam, you came to Brazil to do as part of Global Metal. What was your impressions about the country, man?
Oh, man. I love Brazil, really. We've had so many fantastic experiences in Brazil. You know, because metal is so big in Brazil, I've had the opportunity to go there several times, you know, for Global Metal, obviously for the Maiden film. We've gone down to do film festivals and go to events in Brazil. You know, once this whole pandemic gets out of the way, Brazil's near the top of my list. I want to go to Brazil just to have a vacation for once.
You have some Brazilian in your crew, am I right?
Yeah. Actually, there's a guy right now who works with us in Toronto, Daniel Williams. He's half Brazilian, half Canadian. He works with us, and when we have some time, we like to get into talking about Brazil. But always had such a fantastic time in Brazil. Loved the energy of the country and the people and the passion and the music and everything.
Sepultura. I know you're a big fan of Sepultura.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Don't get me started on Sepultura. They're one of the all-time greats. Still are.
You know that I did my documentary too about punk rock in Brazil.
Cool.
This one, man, took me 4 years to do it. Can you believe that?
Congratulations. It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. Sam, thanks a lot. I hope to see you down here to interview you in person.
Me too, Gastão. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.